Hello, genealogists. This is Craig, and today we continue our journey into genealogy as Pastime and Profession by Donald Lyons Jacobus. And we're now in Chapter 5, Early Nomenclature. It has often been remarked that the early settlers in New England, particularly those who came in the great wave of immigration between the years 1620 and 1650, were more nearly homogeneous than were the founders of the southern colonies. Certainly it is that such contrasts as existed in the former case were less violent than that, for example, between the aristocrats and the deported criminals of Virginia. Yet, outside of primitive tribes, it may be doubted if an entirely homogeneous people has ever existed. And the Puritans, though mainly sprung from the English yeomanry, had their castes. Difficult as it frequently is to draw the line of demarcation in specific instances, in a general way, the first generation of New Englanders may be divided into two classes. The first class, constituting a majority of the population, was composed of those who were in sympathy, at least, with Puritan ideals. The second class, a substantial minority, drew from various elements: the adventurers who hoped to better themselves materially in the New World, the servants who accompanied well-to-do Puritans, and the ne'er-do-wells who felt safer outside of England. The trend of history is often reflected in the very names borne by the men and women who played a part in it. The Assyriologist, for example, merely on the strength of the names borne by certain kings, whether Semite or not, can reconstruct the probable course of history 4 or 5 millenniums ago. It is interesting to see how far the succession of historical movements, the changes in manners and standards, during the first 2 centuries of New England life affected the nomenclature of the inhabitants. The first settlers bore names of 3 different types: those of English origin, those of Hebrew origin, and those which were intended to have a moral significance. The Old English names, on account of their connection with the Church of England, were not in favor with the Puritans. Those who bore them were, as a rule, either not Puritans at all, or else had been christened before their parents turned nonconformists. For 100 years, this class of names was not common, since even non-Puritan families were influenced by the prevailing mode. In some instances, though these are comparatively rare, filial piety caused the retention throughout this period of an old family name, such as Roger or Edward. And there was one family which, uninterruptedly for generations, endowed its daughters with a sturdy Saxon name of Alfred. And despite the prejudice against English names, it is curious to note that this prejudice apparently did not apply to surnames. From the first, it was a common practice to give a boy his mother's surname. The most numerous of the 3 types of names employed by Puritans was the biblical group. Here, with the exception of thoroughly anglicized names such as John, James, or Thomas, the Old Testament patriarchs and prophets were the favorites. The established church in England had made common use of New Testament names, and the Puritans wished their children to be distinguished from conformists even by their personal names. The name Peter, because of the apostles' traditional connection with the papacy, was not common, but it was not so easy to explain the aversion to Paul. This name was as rare as Saria, Shebana, Bezaleel, or any of the least known biblical characters. There was a natural dislike of Cain, Delilah, Jezebel, Herod, and the rest of the scriptural rascals and vampires. Judas is rare, though Jude and Judah occur. We also find Judith, the feminine of this name, indicating an acquiescence with the Apocrypha. Adam and Eve, the parents of all our woe, do not appear to have been popular. Other names like Christopher and Christian, Angel and Angelina, Michael and Gabriel, though sanctioned by the Anglican Church, were perhaps held too sacred for mortals to bear. They are among the most uncommon names to be found in Puritan families. But the names we meet for generations in every town and hamlet of New England are those of the patriarchs from Abraham to Joseph and his brethren. Those are the famous leaders and kings of the Israelites, such as Moses, Joshua, Gideon, Samuel, and David, and those of the major prophets. However rare they may be, it is possible to find namesakes of practically every person mentioned between the covers of the Bible. The chief reason for this is probably the old custom of opening the Bible with the eyes shut and giving the child the name which happened to be nearest to the pointed finger. This custom may explain the occasional use of place names like Eden and Sinai instead of personal names. The name, notwithstanding Griswold, may be similarly explained. So also the fact that in 1721, one Samuel Pond inflicted his helpless son with the name of Many Tekel Upharsin. It is not easy to think of any other rational explanation unless Mr. Pond, having in mind the interpretation of the handwriting on the wall, intended to commemorate the final downfall of the Stuarts, which 7 years before had been assured by the succession of the House of Hanover. The confusion of the biblical Mehitable with the Latin Mabel, the names were used interchangeably, often perplexes the amateur genealogist, and the origin of the confusion is not apparent. Of course, the most interesting and perhaps most characteristic names were those signifying moral attributes, intended to incite the bearers of them to lead godly lives. Names of this type in New England were much more common for girls than for boys, and were seldom so grotesque as some of the monstrous combinations employed by the Puritans in England. Among the popular names for girls were Content, Lowly, Mindwell, Obedience, Patience, Silence, Submit, and Temperance. What a contemporary on the qualities deemed desirable in women. Charity, Mercy, and Prudence, in use before Bunyan wrote, received an increase in popularity from their appearance in his allegories. The name Beulah originated with Bunyan. Comfort, Delight, Faith, Hope, Thankful, Desire. With names like these now charming, at least in their girlhood, these Puritan damsels must have been marriage at an early age, and the bearing of 8 or more children, and the loss irreparable to them of their teeth, aged them rapidly. If they could have only have provided themselves with false teeth and grandmotherly spectacles, how few old hags there would have been to suspect of witchcraft. Among the names given to boys, we may note consider, let us consider together, saith the Lord, ransom, a ransom for many, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, and saving, referring not to thrift, but to the grace of God. Virtue and jealous occur, but are infrequent. It is remarkable how quickly the names of this group were standardized, one portion being assigned to boys, the other to girls. The reasons determining this assignment remain obscure in many instances. Why should deliverance, relief, and recompense customarily be assigned to boys and experience, reliance, and repentance to girls? It is odd that wait and waitzel should be masculine, hope and hope still usually feminine, and that Lovewell should be a man's name and free love a woman's. Elder William Brewster, the Mayflower, named his son Love, but elsewhere his name is usually feminine, and a single case has been found where Mercy, a popular name for girls, was applied to a boy. The sex of the rare names was differentially standardized in different localities, and even in case of some of the common names, uniformity was not absolute. Some of the names of this group apparently were improvised to commemorate some special occasions, preserved as an example of this class. During the War of the Revolution, many boys were christened Freedom, Liberty, or Independence. The name Doctor has sometimes bestowed on a seventh son in allusion to the superstition that 7 sons possessed an intuitive knowledge of the use of herbs. Mariner was occasionally bestowed on the son of a seafaring family, and there is at least one instance of Sail True, not a bad name for a sailor. The relation between parent and child determines such names as Lent, Gift, and Welcome. The names Lament and Trial, sad to say, were considered appropriate for girls born out of wedlock. Incidentally, boys born out of wedlock were usually given the name of the reputed father. Posthumous girls occasionally were christened Orphan or Phina. Similarly, the biblical names Beni and Benjamin, in remembrance of the death of Rachel, were frequently given to boys whose mothers died in childbirth, while Ichabod was popular for posthumous boys. There were also names particular to certain localities. In ancient Woodbury, Connecticut, for instance, 3 feminine names, though rare elsewhere, were very common: Emblem, Concurrence, usually abbreviated to Currence, and Olive, a variant of the stately Olivia. Other names were peculiar to certain families. The mother of an early settler in Hartford rejoiced in the Italian name of Violet, which for generations was bequeathed on her descendants, and this name was otherwise so exceedingly rare that, whenever it occurs in this region, the genealogist at once surmises and seeks to establish a connection to this particular family. Among the more unusual names, we must not fail to mention Be Fruitful Brockett, who died in infancy, and Maybe Barnes. The origin of the latter names has not been ascertained. Perhaps, possibly it was intended for the surname Mabel, just why Matthew and Rhoda Blakesley called their 15th child Careful. We shall not attempt to surmise. At times, these Puritan parents exhibited a woeful lack of humor, or else humor of a tasteless variety. We cannot suppose that the parents of Preserved Fish, Green Plum, or Ivory Keys, boys, or those of Active Foot, Rhonda Bull, or Rhonda Way, or Silence Noise, girls, intended a double entendre. On the other hand, the father of Happy Sad must have selected his son's name with deliberative malice, as surely as Jonathan Rose intentionally alluded to the Song of Solomon when he named his son Sharon. Some of the early Puritans undoubtedly cherished the same delight in the bizarre, which at a later date, about 1800, caused Dr. O.C. Dutton to name his 11th child Sebastian Maria Ximenes Petruccio and his 12th child Thomas Alfred Bonaparte Jefferson. Polycarpus Nelson of Mamaroneck, New York, had his eldest son christened Mather Shalil Hashbaz. How many today are well enough acquainted with the Bible to open its pages to that fearful name? From about the middle of the 18th century onward, a gradual change and apparent in the ideas of the manner of life in the inhabitants of New England, contact with the British and French during the Indian Wars broke the crust of their provincialism and the long War of the Revolution, which placed them shoulder to shoulder with other colonists. The Dutch of New York, the gentlemen of Virginia, could not but broaden their mental horizon. The colleges, which at first had been more classical schools for the training of clergymen, became more humane. Their library shelves held more books of a secular and liberal tendency. College societies began to enact English comedies. As the merchant class grew more affluent, the younger generation studied law and medicine. Culture was imposed on wealth. It was natural that, as the opportunities for sensuous luxury and for intellectual enjoyment increased, there should be a rebellion against the narrowness of Puritan dogma and the aridity of Puritan life. Many were infected with disclaim. Many were infected with deism, a philosophy in which the poetry of Pope, not to mention the Calvinistic fatalism of Jonathan Edwards, afforded an easy transition. Many more embraced the Church of England, which, in addition to its religious and aesthetic appeal, tolerated the more innocent pastimes. What was true of the upper stratum of New England society was true in even greater measure of the lower straits. The descendants of the adventurers and the roysters who had caused so much annoyance in the early Puritans had only a rare instance risen to position in church or civil life. There were still, at the foot of the ladder, still made to feel their inferiority. The Anglican Church was at this time doing missionary work in the colonies. The congregational societies in some of the New England colonies constituted the established church, for a long period acknowledged by the civil government and authorized to tax all citizens, whether members or not, for its maintenance. Eager to gain converts, the Anglican missionaries did not spurn these black sheep of Puritanism, but welcomed them to the fold. It is not difficult to understand the success of the Church of England in proselytizing those heretofore had been of little standing in New England society. Doubtless the prestige and more elaborate ritual of the Mother Church impressed them. Here, too, they found a religious body which was more tolerant of frivolity, more ready to admit the weakness of the flesh and to pardon the carnal sins. But the most powerful desire was perhaps to improve their social status, to form a community of their own to which they could move undisturbed by the censure of puritanical bigotry. Thus it came about that between 1700 and 1775, the newer aristocracy of wealth and the white trash of the New England colonies both gravitated towards the Church of England. The middle classes, still constituting a vast majority of the population and carrying with them the remnants of the older Puritan aristocracy of birth and personal worth, clung to the tenets of their fathers, but even here the infiltration of new ideas was discernible. Religious zeal lost its intensity and the moral fiber of its toughness. Manners grew more lax, and there was greater freedom of intercourse between the sexes. The 18th century was altogether a more comfortable period to live in than the 17th century had been. The old standards were breaking up, society was growing more complex, opinions were becoming more divergent and irreconcilable. Through the transition era, this time of shifting ideas and changing manners, the trend of history may be read in the name bestowed on the children of the age. Biblical names still greet us, but the uncommon ones begin to drop out until only the more popular survive. Side by side with them, the good old English names, long disused, but not forgotten, reappear with increasing frequency. The Church of England was in no small degree responsible for the revival of Saxon names, for the Anglican families had employed these names throughout the period when most of their contemporaries were Israelites indeed. Our gratitude is not lacking as Hezekiah and Zechariah make room for Henry and Edmund, and we hail the return of Dorothy and Margaret. But we must not, in our own complacency, overlook a long list of names of an entirely new class which make their appearance in the register of births. Where once it had been essential to choose names from one book of sacred scriptures, it now became a fashion to flitch names from any book. A renaissance of classics had indicated that we find ourselves confronted with Virgil, Aeneas, and Horace. The great English novels of the generation were also read. The popularity of Richardson may be gauged by the number of Clarissas and Pamelas who kept home fires burning for the soldiers of Valley Forge. Nor were Fielding's Amelia or Smollett's Narcissa neglected. Shakespearean heroes and heroines, especially the latter, come into favor: Miranda, Orlando, Sylvia, Celia, Julia, and a host of others. Other names, unfamiliar yet modern in appearance when contrasted with Obadiah and Keturah, were doubtless stolen from some forgotten romance, some bestseller of that generation. Calvin, Luther, and the names of other theologians and divines became common, and in Lamira, the hymnal appears to have furnished at least one name. Finally, a few names such as George and Frederick, Caroline, Henrietta were borrowed from royalty and English aristocracy. In a word, it became at last the unquestioned prerogative of parents to take names from any and every available source, and we must not forget the influence of newspapers in the latter half of the 18th century in propagating the names of public characters. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of the nomenclature in the new era was the transformation undergone by the names of the preceding period. Nor could any more striking illustration be found of the greater laxity of manners prevailing than the nicknames which fill the baptismal registers, both congregational and episcopal. Among the feminine derivatives of common occurrence were Sally, Sarah, Molly and Polly, Mary, Betty, Elizabeth, Patty, Martha, Nabby, Abigail, Senny, Aniseth, Kitty, Mehitable, Dolly, Dorothy, Suki, Susan, Tenty, Content, and Bede, Obedience. Though less frequently, masculine names were subjected at times to similar diminution, such as Tom and Ned, and Raya for Azariah, and Jeer for Jeremiah, bear witness. We have crossed the threshold of the 19th century, a century in which the increasing complexity of social strata, the increasing diversity of interests, and the diversity of blood introduced through Ireland, Germany, and elsewhere, matched by a corresponding diversity in the nomenclature. It will be wise to take our leave of the New England of the Puritans at this point, before the threads of the discourse are quite lost in the labyrinth we are approaching. And this brings to an end Chapter 5, Early Nomenclature. This has been Craig. This has been Just Genealogy. We look forward to hearing from you, and we'll see you next time.